Tonight on The Body Politic, cutting the lifeline of terror. What's next after Iraq? Hello, I'm Michael Bernstein, and this is The Body Politic. The U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq has led to a rise in anti-Americanism in Europe and the Muslim world, and, some say, to an increase in the pool of potential terrorists willing to strike the United States. We'll talk tonight about what the U.S. might do to change its image abroad and how that might lead to a drop in terrorist recruitment. My guest is Dan Yankelovich, a social scientist with a long career in polling and analyzing public opinion for major news organizations and research institutions. Dan, welcome.
Thank you, Michael.
You've gathered and analyzed some fascinating data about public opinion in the Muslim world, in Europe, and here in the United States.
Yes.
So tell us about those data, how they were collected, what sources you were working with.
Well, the surveys in the Muslim world are really surprisingly good and complete. And there are a number of different sources. I've drawn on the data we'll look at in a few minutes from three major sources. One is the Zogby polling organization. The second is the Pew Global Attitudes survey. And the third is Gallup. So other organizations have also contributed, but I'm going to draw on those three. They are very large-scale surveys across the breadth of Arab countries and Muslim countries, and they're quite well done.
So they're not isolated to the Middle East in this case?
No, some are Middle East, but others are broadly Muslim, across the Muslim world. Not all 57 nations, but various cross-sections of nations.
And the data also are quite recent.
Yes, I mean, the data, I'm going to point out to some data that shows the difference between 2002 and 2003 when we went into Iraq. But the data is increasingly recent. It's being done all the time.
Well, let's begin. We'll take a look at, we can't possibly do justice to all the data you've collected. It's an enormous data set, but you've selected some very interesting samples for us. You have some initial findings to share with us about opinion in the Arab and Muslim world, about the United States, and about the invasion in Iraq.
I've just selected a very tiny fraction, but I wanted to show you and our viewers in this first chart the paltry numbers of people in these countries allied to us, ranging from our ally Egypt, 13% holding favorable opinions of the United States, to 3% in Saudi Arabia. Derisory numbers. Really, these are appalling statistics.
And again, to emphasize, these are nations formerly allied with the United States
and currently
in the war on terror. So that's right.
That's right. This next chart shows across 7 out of 8 Muslim countries are worried about a military threat from the United States. I think this is very difficult for most Americans to comprehend, that a lot of what's going on in the Muslim world, particularly in the Arab world, is driven by the fear that we have declared war on them. So you have this, we feel we're in a war that was declared on us. They feel a real military threat, and you can see from the chart that in 7 out of 8 of these Muslim countries, very large majorities are fearful of a military threat coming from the United States.
Yes, it's even striking, even in Kuwait. I mean, it's not a large majority, but a majority, a clear majority.
In our ally Jordan, and in the largest Muslim country in the world, Indonesia. Indonesia has been a huge change where they've gone from mostly favorable to mostly unfavorable points of view toward the United States. And I just want to show 2 numbers in this next chart, which I think is at the heart of this feeling, that only 12% or so of people in Muslim countries believe that we in the United States respect Islamic values, and even fewer, 7%, feel that the West, particularly the United States, has any understanding of Muslim culture and customs. And I think that's that feeling of neglect, of humiliation, of not even being part of our mindset that has caused, is behind a lot of the animosity that we're confronting.
I'm also curious, Dan, here you have 18% believe Arabs carried out the 9/11 attacks. So a substantial proportion believe someone else was
fewer than
responsible.
1 out of 5.
And is there some indication of who they believe actually carried out?
Well, it varies all over the lot, all the way from the fantasy that the Israeli intelligence service Mossad is behind it, to just a general rejection of the idea that Arabs could do such a thing.
So we have some very interesting and indeed disturbing insight into opinions of the United States in the Muslim world. You also have some striking evidence about European anti-Americanism.
I think that in this chart here contains some of the most surprising data I've ever seen, in the sense that the vastness of the increase just over a 1-year period from 2002 to 2003, when we went to war, invaded Iraq, and you see the doubling or tripling in countries like Italy, or in Britain, our ally, in Poland, our ally, as well as in Germany and France and Turkey and other nations. Just going from minorities who had an unfavorable view of the United States to very large majorities. The suddenness of the change, in a way, gives some hope, because if it changed negatively so quickly, maybe it can also subside in the future if we find the right way to curb this growing anti-Americanism.
The rapid shift you've documented here, all linked with the war in Iraq, not the operations in Afghanistan.
There was wide-scale support for the operations in Afghanistan. There was some concern in Muslim countries about the United States invading a Muslim country, a Christian, Judaic civilization invading Muslim Afghanistan. But the rationale was understood, that they were harboring al-Qaeda. But for us to go into a second Muslim country and invade it preemptively from their point of view, without provocation, without the fact that it was harboring al-Qaeda, really distresses them.
And indeed, no credible evidence was ever developed about weapons of mass destruction.
Oh, yes, and as that has become clearer, no evidence of weapons of mass destruction, no evidence of link with al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein, it exacerbates the animosity and hostility.
Let's shift the focus.
Yes.
Here at home, you have lots of Gallup data, Washington Post, ABC polls about attitudes and opinions here in the United States. So why don't you note some of the highlights that you captured in these data?
I wanted to point to one fact which I think is not well recognized and is illustrated in this next chart, which is that Saddam's capture last December was regarded as a major victory. Ironically, it was the beginning of the erosion of support for the war in Iraq, because it raised high, unrealistic expectations. And if you just glance at this chart, you'll see the level of those. Saddam's capture will restore peace and security in Iraq. It will restore peace and security in the United States. Bin Laden will be captured. A democratic government will be established. Attacks on our troops will decrease. And weapons of mass destruction will be found. All held by majorities, large majorities. And of course, what's happened in 2004 is that every one of these expectations has been dashed, and as it has been dashed, you have this massive erosion of support for the war in Iraq.
In several of these cases, the percentages have dropped below half, correct? As best you can tell from
Well, I
more
think
recent,
that, yeah,
more
I
recent
think
data?
that almost all the statistics show, bewilderment and a realization that these things just haven't happened. And there are all sorts of charts showing support and confidence in the conduct of the war in Iraq, dropping from majority to minority status. I've just pulled out one indicator, which is a favorite of people in the polling profession, which is the change in the view that the country is on the wrong track. Now, that's not just foreign policy, it's also domestic policy, but it sort of sums up this change from last year to this year, where last year fewer than 40%, 2 out of 5, felt the country was on the wrong track.
This in
and
April
now
of
that's
2003.
6 out of 10. Right.
And
So it just sort of encapsulates the overall view of the country. And I think it stems from that sense of dashed expectations.
It goes back to the previous chart,
Yes,
where
right.
Saddam's capture actually increased confidence and
Yeah, well,
hopes
that
for a
was,
rapid solution.
the rationale for the war was Saddam with his link and with his control over weapons of mass destruction. So when he was captured, people said, well, okay, that's it.
Things should resolve quickly.
Yeah, this is going to settle very quickly. So those are just a handful of data that I wanted to share with you.
Given these findings, and the trends, as you point out, the trends in these findings
Yes.
are quite clear. Let's explore a little bit what they tell us, or what they suggest to us about what the United States might expect in the immediate future
Yes.
and in the longer run with respect to terrorism,
Yeah.
the Al-Qaeda network, opinions of the United States and its policies overseas. What are some of the immediate and indeed even longer term effects you see for us, given the findings you've analyzed in these polling data?
One factor that is somewhat hopeful, because it's not obvious in the midst of the fiery passions of the campaign and the partisanship of the campaign, but actually there's a growing consensus both among Democrats and among Republicans about the fact that we have to find a way to put Iraq behind us. And I've summed it up in this chart. And this is sort of a bipartisan growing consensus that we can't let Iraq become a haven for terrorists. That's our minimum bottom line on Iraq. That handing over sovereignty and some degree of help from other nations can prevent Iraq from becoming a black hole, both for US dollars and also for troops. And that the cost to us is yielding some power and influence in Iraq, more than we would like to, and also maybe taking our chances on establishing democracy in Iraq, not pushing that so hard as a realistic short-term goal. And also a feeling that, well, if we're serious about our national security, these costs, although they're a scaling down of what we originally expected, are acceptable to both sides for different reasons. And both political parties are moving in this direction. So I think we don't see that now, but I think once the election is behind us, we'll begin to see the effects of this consensus. I think what's going to happen is we're going to Afghanistanize Iraq. Afghanistan sort of disappeared from the front pages, from the top of the news, even though there was no dramatic resolution or settlement, and even though in some respects that is not a good situation. But it was important for us to put it behind us because we wanted to move on to Iraq. Now I think Iraq is going to move into that same situation because of a feeling that we have to put Iraq behind us if we're going to go back to what many believe has been a diversion from our primary goal of doing something more about Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is the enemy. Al-Qaeda attacked us in the past. Al-Qaeda is threatened to attack us in the future. And I think that increasingly we're going to have to return to a sharp focus on destroying al-Qaeda.
Let's talk about that, that last matter.
Yeah.
The potential resolution of the situation in Iraq is one thing, but the threats to the United States from the al-Qaeda network and other extremist groups are still rated as quite high by the government,
yes.
and as your polling data show, by the American people.
Yes.
And I think your data also suggests that the American people in general, struggle for a kind of coherent understanding or strategy as to what to do about that threat.
Yeah.
So you have some evidence and ideas to share with us about how the American people might go about thinking through this problem.
Well, the conclusion I've come to from studying all this data, and a lot of people who have written and commented on it, when you show data showing the extent of increase in dislike and fear of the United States, there are many people who dismiss that and say, so what else is new? It isn't important that we be liked as long as we're respected and feared. And even if we don't like, they don't like us because they envy us for our success and that sort of thing. And I think that kind of observation is often true, and it may have been true in the past. It is not true in this specific instance because al-Qaeda's strategy is not to be a small, static organization, but to recruit. Al-Qaeda is the militant arm of the Islamist terrorist movement. And to the extent that it can recruit, and recruit easily, and the more dislike and more hatred there is for the United States, the easier it is really for al-Qaeda to recruit new terrorists. Secretary Rumsfeld, in this memo that was leaked some months ago, made this point very clearly. He said, well, what's going to happen if for every one al-Qaeda that we destroy 10 new recruits
are recruited? That's right.
And I think that is a very valid point, and that's exactly the point of this data, that the more humiliation and anger and hatred, despair is felt in these Muslim countries, the easier it is to gain these recruits. And
I take it your point as well is, to those who say it really doesn't matter what perceptions abroad of the United States are, to those who say that, you say the solution here is not solely a military one. You can't simply batten down all the hatches and pretend that these networks can't have an impact, can't launch other attacks. The issue is stifling the recruitment of the soldiers of these networks.
I think so. I think very much so. I just try to characterize it in this chart because I think that stopping new terrorist recruitment, nothing will contribute more to the safety of the United States. It's not al-Qaeda, a small militant group, who is the enemy. It is their ability to recruit from this massive Muslim Islamist movement that cuts across 57 countries and 1.3 billion.
In fact, you make an interesting point. You have another chart here about the sort of three ingredients of this hate America
network. I think that most people tend to think of the enemy as a nation state. The enemy is not a nation state. The enemy is a movement, a social political movement spread across many nations and is strongest, and this is something that has to be understood by the public. This movement is strongest in the countries that are allied to us. It's not in Iraq and Iran and Syria where these movements are strongest. It's in Pakistan. It's in Saudi Arabia. It's in Egypt. It's in Yemen. It's in Indonesia. So until you get that understanding, I don't think we can begin to confront the enemy. In my life's work as a social scientist, I found that in studying social political movements, there are always three legs of the stool, three major ingredients to any successful movement. First, there is a small group of determined militants. And then, and this is the key one, there is a huge group of moderates who disagree with the tactics of the militants, but feel they have a legitimate grievance. And then, if you cap it off, there is a scapegoat. And it's when you get those three combined, Osama bin Laden leading the militants, this huge, vast movement across these countries, and the United States, a big, fat scapegoat, that you have the real danger. And of course, the strategy is implicit, shown in this chart, that the strategy needs to somehow find a way to attack the militants in military means, but you can't isolate Al-Qaeda among the Muslim moderates through military means. You need other methods, you need public diplomacy, you need political strategy, and you need time.
Isn't there a major difficulty here with the fact that terrorism per se is a tactic?
Yes.
For what purposes that tactic is used is another matter. And when you talk about taking steps to persuade the moderate segments of a foreign population about either the virtues or the weaknesses of the United States, or indeed to try to dissuade them from embracing a militant network, aren't we really talking about addressing those strategic questions for which terrorism is then used as a tactic?
I think a reference to terrorism is useful for this reason. We have vast, well-organized, well-resourced resources. The other side represents what the military call an asymmetrical threat. They don't have those resources, but what they do have is they have secrecy, they have ideology, and they have a political appeal, and they have terrorism. And terrorism is the equalizer. They have the gun. So it doesn't bother me that we refer to the war on terrorism, that terrorism is a tactic. But I think that I think there's a lot of misunderstanding on this point, that this notion of winning hearts and minds that was important in Vietnam.
In the Vietnam era.
A lot of people feel, and I agree with them, that it's a little late for that sort of PR, public diplomacy, these sort of genteel exchange programs and libraries and so forth. They're all very helpful, but I think there's something much more hard-edged. The fact is that we have to find a way, sooner or later, to persuade this Islamist movement that killing Americans is not going to get what they're looking for. They are looking for successful, just societies. And killing Americans is not going to do it for them. It's going to undermine it. Conversely, support of the United States, partnership with the United States, a positive relationship with the United States could help them achieve what they are seeking, which is fair and just societies. And I think I don't think there's any way that we can do that in the short term of a year or so. I think we need to buy time, and I think the only way we can buy time is by attacking Al-Qaeda and keeping it off balance until we have the 3, 5, 7, 10-year period where we can revise and modify our political policies to do what needs to be done.
Well, as you say, dealing with Al-Qaeda or related networks is a military and indeed military intelligence issue.
But separating the moderates from convincing the moderates that it is not in their interest to support the militants is a political objective, and it requires political means.
To take up that last point, isn't it true, or I should ask you, is it true from the data you've been able to analyze, that these moderate segments of the population tend to focus on issues such as the world oil economy and what they perceive to be as U.S. efforts to control it, and the question of Israel and the aspirations of the Palestinians living in the diaspora, the Palestinian diaspora? Aren't these the political issues that these moderates see as being center stage?
They are among the political issues. I think that the Israeli-Palestinian problem is disproportionately important because it symbolizes for the Arabs it's the defeat that stares them in the face every day of their inability to somehow cope with the challenge of the West and the challenge of modernity. But I think this has gone so far that even if we were to pick the Arab-Israeli conflict and start with it and make some headway, I don't think that would do the job. We need to do that sooner or later, but the main perception of these Islamists is that we are trying to impose our culture, our beliefs, our forms of governance on them, and we are continuing the colonialism and the exploitation of the past, and we are supporting corrupt governments, repressive, autocratic governments, and until we get to the point where we can address those issues, I don't think that we'll be able to win over the kind of sympathy and support that we expect. And I think Americans have almost no conception of, if you were to describe the Islamist image of the United States as the aggressor nation, always on the side of injustice, average Americans would stare at you as if you'd lost your mind. So we have this dialogue of the deaf. This,
yes, there's the disjunction between how Americans perceive the wider world
and how the Muslim world perceives
us. Of course, it's always sobering to keep in mind that the vast majority of Americans do not travel internationally, have not visited these parts of the world.
Even if they do, it's hard stuff. It's hard stuff to digest. It's very distorted. It's been promoted by friendly governments to us because it helps them keep their domestic issues. So it's not only the radical militants who are spreading these distortions about the United States, it's also our allied governments. I mean, Saudi Arabia has supported these madrasas or schools in other Muslim countries through both money and staffing, and these schools are sort of schools of hatred, that they preach a kind of Wahhabi, radical hatred of the infidel, and you brainwash millions of young Muslims. What can you expect?
Well, on that note, we'll have to conclude. Dan Yankelovich, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
My guest has been Dan Yankelovich, a longtime pollster and analyst of public opinion surveys throughout the world. Thank you all for joining us on The Body Politic. I'm Michael Bernstein. Good night.